not the initiator, of course, but it was very important. Yes.
You are going to read the Tarkabhāṣā?
Yes.
Okay. Someone, like 15, 20 minutes ago, said, so I asked what was the topic, and someone said Mokṣākaragupta, and I asked what's that about, and someone said it was some sutra?
No. We do two different, because I was reading Tarkabhāṣā and he was reading some Tantra, so two of us read
What we are reading, right?
Okay.
So only what I'm reading. Was when I was reading at that moment, sitting there.
I was mentally impressed by Mokṣākaragupta. I was not aware that he was in tantric work. I made a mental note.
I see.
Thinking that.
Did
just
he
like,
bet?
yeah.
Well, it might have. I actually don't know because I haven't checked the list of his works. We have to check the Tangur and see whether there's any tantric work by Mokṣākaragupta. It's fairly possible, actually. I think there's. I forgot who is the master who begins. Is it Vidyākarashanti? There's one master who's a Pramana master who starts with a Mangalacharana, I think, for Hevajja. In a Pramana text. So that's not so strange, actually.
Yeah, like Ratna.
I don't think he does so in his Pramana text, but I don't remember that well. But I think that Vidyākarashanti in the Tarkabhāṣā might. I have to recheck it. But
So, yeah, sorry.
no problem. Okay, so I was mentioning about Dharmakirti. So Dharmakirti is, we can say, the most prominent successor of Dignaga. Who is Dignaga? Dignaga is among the students of Vasubandhu the one who excelled in Pramana. So Dignaga offered a kind of new system of Pramana in a way. He divided Pramana in a clear-cut manner. Pramana means of valid knowledge. How do we obtain valid, sound, reliable knowledge? So while this is discussed a lot in a number of Indian systems, before Dignaga it seems that there was no clear-cut demarcation of a specific Buddhist way of dealing with Pramana. How many Pramanas are there, etc., etc. To the extent that we find some pre-Dignaga texts more or less dealing with Pramana, accepting 4 Pramanas. 4 Pramanas is the same Pramanas employed by the Nyaya system. And also Chandrakirti resisting Dignaga's system of 2 Pramanas and saying that he accepts 4. Chandrakirti quotes a verse where there's a list of 4 Pramanas, and that verse is not traceable from any Nyaya source, and it could well be from a Buddhist source, because we do have some evidence, at least from the Chinese, of pre-Dignaga texts on Pramana which accept 4 Pramanas, even within the Buddhist fold. So, this special feature of Dignaga's system is that he only accepts 2 Pramanas, Pratyaksha and Anumana. These are difficult to translate, actually. The usual translations are direct perception and inference. Pratyaksha is usually translated as direct perception, and Anumana is usually translated as inference. I prefer other translations which are a bit more respectful of the etymology of the word. For example, Pratyaksha could be translated as proximity to the senses. Pratyaksha is a compound which can be analyzed in at least 2 ways. It is commonly understood as a pradi Tatpurusha, and sometimes as a Bahuvrihi. For example, Chandrakirti takes it to be a Bahuvrihi. You might remember that we had a discussion about this point with Haru in Hamburg. Or maybe not. Well, we did have a discussion about this because it's not so frequent to consider it a Bahuvrihi, but that's how it is considered by Chandrakirti. So it can be considered in either way. And it can be a word on its own right, or it can qualify another word. So often pratyaksha is usually understood as pratyaksha jnanam in the system of Dignaga and Dharmakirti. So for them, pratyaksha is a type of cognition. But that is not always the case. Even in Dharmakirti's own writing, sometimes pratyaksha qualifies the object. So you can have a pratyaksha vishaya, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it is pratyakshasya jnanasya vishaya. It can just mean that it is pratyaksha vishaya. It is the object which is proximate to the senses. And this usage is found elsewhere, for example in Chandrakirti. It's also found, I think, in the Abhidharma Samuccaya or the Bhāṣya. So this usage of pratyaksha does exist. You have to be aware that this word is made up of prati plus aksha. Aksha there doesn't mean the eyes, but it means all the indriyas. The word aksha doesn't always mean eyes, it can be all the sense faculties, and prati there means proximate to. That's why I prefer proximity to the senses as a translation of pratyaksha. And this translation is a little bit less contentious in the sense that if we offer a translation that already considers pratyaksha to be a type of cognition, we are introducing a commentarial element. It means that we are choosing a specific position about what pratyaksha is. Because I don't think that all Indian philosophers would agree that pratyaksha primarily refers to a cognition. For example, Chandrakirti doesn't. For him, pratyaksha primarily refers to the object that is proximate to the senses. It doesn't refer to the cognition. So our evidence, our real pramana for Chandrakirti is the object that is proximate to the senses, is not the cognition. So we have to keep this in mind and remember that generally speaking, translations are a little bit conventional. They don't always convey the many possibilities that are embedded in the Sanskrit word. However, when we are able to offer a translation which retains the ambiguity of the Sanskrit word, it's better. So it's better to have a translation which says something to the reader, but at the same time retains something as open, so that the translation is going to work fairly well in all the usages of that word. So, pratyaksha is accepted by most Indian philosophers as a valid means of acquiring reliable knowledge, and so is anumana. Anumana usually translated as inference, but we could also translate it as subsequent evaluation. Because usually when it is explained, it's a type of mana, it's a type of evaluation, literally measurement maybe, but measurement doesn't work very well in this context, which happens after. And anu is our upasarga, which has the sense of after, and we will see what is meant by after, because it is going to be discussed in this very text. At least we will know what Mokṣākaragupta understands to be after. After what? After what we do this kind of evaluation. So a special feature of Dignaga and Dharmakirti's system is that they accept only these two pramanas, these two means of valid knowledge, or these two ways of having sound evaluation. Now, what does it mean exactly in comparison to other types of Buddhist and non-Buddhist lists of pramana? For example, let's take another type of pramana, agama or shabda, verbal testimony. Does it mean that Dignaga and Dharmakirti do not consider that the word of a Buddha has any validity to obtain valid knowledge? Is that the meaning? No, it doesn't mean that. What it means is that they consider that the word of a Buddha's validity is established through anumana. So it's a form of anumana. So they subsume that type of verbal knowledge acquired through verbal testimony into anumana. That's really what is meant. So they do not discard the idea that certain types of statements may allow us to obtain valid knowledge. But they explain that that process also is a type of anumana. And anumana means more or less, let's say, a reasoning, a type of reasoning. A reasoning which has to do with establishing usually vyapti, pervasion, logical pervasion between two entities. Why nevertheless do this? Why decide that there are only two pramanas? The main reason is probably because there can be only two types of prameyas, two possible objects of valid cognition. What are the two prameyas? The swalakshana and the samanya lakshana, or just the samanya. The swalakshana is the unique characteristic. So the swalakshana is a dharma taken in its singularity, without disregarding its difference from other dharmas, its difference in time or space. When we disregard that difference, we conceptualize extension or commonality. And this commonality is called samanya. That commonality is purely conceptual, but at the same time, it has some correlation to the real swalakshana. When we have a case of direct perception, what we perceive, or rather, the direct perception is produced by the swalakshana. When we have any type of conceptual reasoning, the conceptual reasoning has as its object the samanya lakshana, a conceptually extended entity, extended in time and space. For the Sautrantika and the Dharmakirtis and Dignaga system, entities are not extended in time and space. They last only one moment, and they are like points. So they do not have any real extension. Extension is conceptually created when we group together a certain number of real entities. And that's when we can start giving them names. There's no possibility of employing names for the swalakshana because the swalakshana doesn't last long enough. So if we use the name again, it will not be able to refer to it again. So it's our language needs to be able to refer to more than one thing with one name, and therefore the swalakshanas cannot really, they are not fit to be they cannot be cognized by a cognition which is fit to be put into words. Because if you put it into words, you are speaking in terms of commonalities. That's why the listener can understand. And if something has no commonality whatsoever with anything else, you cannot really describe it positively. So that's one of the features of the Svalakshana. The terms Svalakshana and Samanya Lakshana are used maybe a little bit differently from the way in which they're used in Abhidharma. Usually in Abhidharma they're used a bit differently, so you should be aware of that. If you're familiar with these terms in Abhidharma, you should know that that's a little bit different. Here Svalakshana really means what is unique to a specific dharma lasting just one moment. And Samanya Lakshana means any conceptually extended characteristic. So, in accordance with this twofold subdivision, we have a number of texts in the Pramana tradition which are divided into 3 chapters. The first chapter usually deals with pratyaksha, so this proximity to the senses. The second chapter usually deals with swartha anumana, which is this subsequent evaluation which is done within oneself, for oneself and within oneself. So the reasoning that one does in one's own mind. And the other one is parartha anumana. So this subsequent consideration verbalized for the sake of others, para artha. And that's when the context of actual debate comes. So in the pratyaksha section, what you will get usually is a definition of pratyaksha. Well, first of all, there will be the subdivision into 2 pramanas. What's the characteristic of pratyaksha? How many types of pratyaksha, etc., etc. In the Swartha Anumana section, you will get a basic description of what makes for a valid reasoning. And in the Parartha Anumana, you will get what is most relevant for a debate. So a series of possible fallacies, for example. So that means also that there is a clear-cut relationship between the second and the third part, because many of the fallacies are due to some defect in the basic reasoning. That then makes our debate, our manner of debating itself defective. So there is a link between these two. And the last part is employed sometimes to discuss philosophy more broadly. This is what Mokṣākaragupta does. In the last part, he introduces an overview of Buddhist philosophy, following Ācārya and even quoting some of his verses. So this is to give you a general idea about the topic. Dharmakirti is extremely important and influential. This successor of Dignaga became so important that hardly any Buddhist philosopher after him could ignore him. Of course, he's also well known by the non-Buddhist Indian traditions. Indeed, in some sense, he's the non-Buddhist philosopher, the Buddhist philosopher for the non-Buddhists. Usually, when non-Buddhist philosophers are aware of Buddhist philosophy, if at all, they're going to be aware of Dharmakirti. That's quite common. And one reason is because, as I have hinted at earlier, the context of pramana is, at least in part, the context of debate. And pramana, to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent, is a neutral ground. This means that there are Buddhist pramana treatises commented upon by non-Buddhists. Haribhadra Sudhi commented on the Nyaya Pravesha, for example. And so pramana was something of not exactly worldly topic, but almost. So one of the points that Dharmakirti makes, for example, in terms of how one should go about a debate, is that when one brings up a topic, it should be Vastu Siddha and not Shastra Siddha. What does it mean? Vastu Siddha means that it's something that is kind of agreed by all parties, irrespective of their philosophical leaning. Shastra Siddha means that it is agreed upon only by people who belong to a certain philosophical position. So, for example, I can present an inference about this table because all possible observers will accept at some level that we can discuss about the table. So the table is in some sense Vastu Siddha. And then we can have some reasoning to decide what is it made of. Is it momentary? Is it not momentary? Etc., etc., etc. But if I straight away offer an inference about, let's say, a momentary dharma to a non-Buddhist, this inference will have no value because the non-Buddhist does not accept the momentary dharma in the first place. So that is Shastra Siddha. Or if I'm a Mimamsaka and I give an inference about eternal sound, that's the same thing, because the opponent might not accept that sound is eternal, and so on and so forth. So what one can do is to start an offering inferences in favor or against the idea that sound is eternal. But one cannot start with a presupposition that sound is eternal, because that is not Vastu Siddha, that is Shastra Siddha. So that is an important principle. And you can see that usually Pramana texts are very much in dialogue with non-Buddhist philosophy. There is a certain amount of debate, discussion, their position is taken up, even in terms of just examples. Examples of fallacious reasonings are often taken from non-Buddhist traditions. The Pramana tradition did not develop so much in East Asian Buddhism, as far as I know, although it did to some extent. I think there's even some Japanese indigenous discussions of Pramana. So it went into East Asian Buddhism, just a little bit less. And I don't think it was Dharmakirti, I think it was Dignaga, but not Dharmakirti. And it's very prominent in late India, as well as Tibetan Buddhism. It almost doesn't exist in Pali, but that's quite understandable, because the Pali tradition, compared to the Sanskrit Buddhist tradition, doesn't have that much dialogue with non-Buddhist philosophy. That is not to say that it's completely absent, but you have to dig into the commentaries and sub-commentaries to see some discussion of non-Buddhist philosophy. It's not so common. The Sanskrit tradition, on the other hand, is in a way a bit more cosmopolitan, if you wish, and it has to discuss with non-Buddhists. You can see that there's a debate going on. So usually, to understand well Indian Buddhist philosophy, one should try to learn at least a little bit of non-Buddhist philosophy. So one should try to learn Sankhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Yoga, and the two types of Mimamsa, to some extent. And you will see it in this very text, because in this text at one point we will have a discussion on why are there only two Pramanas and why just these two. And on that occasion Mokṣākaragupta will just briefly take up other positions, non-Buddhist positions, which accept 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Pramanas or more. There's an interesting reference to people who accept a number of our Pramanas, which seem rather uncommon, but I think maybe I have some idea of what he might be referring to, so we might discuss it later. So This is just to give you a general idea of what's the topic of this class, and I've tried to prepare some material to help you. So I will try to explain how this material works.
Please, what are the funny numbers except for
Okay.
M2S? M2S, what is M2? I think 6P I understand, but M2S.
Masculine, second vibhakti singular.
So you divide. Okay. Yeah. First goes for the end and then the sixth step. Okay.
Yeah. So what we have here is first the text. What is between brackets was the editor's choice of titles for the various sections. So that means, yes.
In Tibetan Buddhism, we have three brahmanas. The one is direct perception, and third one is spiritual authority. We say Tibetan Buddhism.
Shabda. That's Shabda or Agama?
Is including brahmanas also.
Yes, but for Dharmakirti, just like for many Tibetan Buddhist masters, actually, this third is subsumed within Anumana. So it is included in the second.
Anumana.
Yes. Shabda, or this you call special authority, usually is Agama or Shabda. There's one more word now. But usually it's these two, Agama or Shabda. This is by Dharmakirti included under Anumana. And a number of Tibetan masters also follow that system. Not all Indian masters did. But I think in the Tibetan tradition is more or less universal. There are actually further subdivisions within the Tibetan tradition. It becomes a little bit more complicated, strictly speaking, because, well, at least some authors, like Mipa Rinpoche, subdivide pramana further into pure and impure pramana. So then you get a double set of pramanas. So that becomes a little bit more complicated.
So in our Tibetan Buddhism, we have different five sects. So every
Yes.
five sect have their own theory
Yeah.
to brahmanas. So now Mipam Rinpoche said, and we have Nyame Shirak Yatsen, Je Tsongkhapa. So their own theory has different brahmanas.
Yes, but even Tsongkhapa, for example, would accept two pramanas. So for example, if you take the Gelug tradition, their system is called the system of the two kirtis. So in their system, actually, it's quite important to show that you can have a system of two pramanas even while reading Chandrakirti. So in that respect, it's a little bit unique, because at an explicit level, Chandrakirti says that he doesn't accept this two pramana system. But one of the features of the Gelug tradition is to say that actually this is compatible. And so it is done in a rather complicated way, actually, but it's one of the hallmarks of the Gelug tradition. And that is to say, this shows the extent to which Dharmakirti was important for the Tibetan tradition. You hardly find, as far as I know, anyone in the 4 or 5 schools who would not follow Dharmakirti's system of two pramanas. Even in terms of very late authors like Mipa Rinpoche, it's basically related to Dharmakirti. So this basic system that we're looking at in this text is very important for late Indian Buddhism and the whole of the Tibetan tradition. Of course, there are differences in terms of how it is integrated in the overall view of the particular school, but that's also because most of the schools have an interest in integrating that with what comes to be called in Tibet Prasangika Madhyamaka. And that's a little bit tricky because we have this explicit statement by Chandrakirti saying that he rejects the two pramana system. Therefore, it can be done in many different ways. It's not so tricky when you take someone like Shantaraksita, who on the other hand clearly accepts the two pramana system. So he already did it, no problem. But when you want to put this together with Chandrakirti, then it's more complicated. And so you have all these different solutions offered by the Tibetan tradition. Moreover, there's one more complication in the Tibetan tradition which we cannot take up here, and it's the reason for having this system of double pramanas, is that there's also a very explicit attempt to put pramana together with Vajrayana. So in the case of Mipa Rinpoche, the reason for having double pramana is because you need a system of pramana which fits with a Vajrayana view as well, which accounts for the type of perception that matches a Vajrayana view. So that makes things even more complicated. But we are here at a much more basic level, which is more or less common to all the schools, if you take the Tibetan Buddhist schools. So in that system, what you had referred to as special authority is, at this level, more or less everyone would agree that that is subsumed under Anumana. And indeed, they will explain how that happens. However, for Dharmakirti, the idea that the Buddha is omniscient and that the Buddha's word have validity as means of knowledge is extremely important, to the extent that he devotes a large section of the Pramana Vartika just to prove that. So this is in fact quite important to the Pramana tradition. It might sound a bit counterintuitive because we might think of Pramana just as something dealing with worldly matters, etc. But in fact, the Pramana tradition has a completely different aspect as well. And there are readings of Dharmakirti which, for example, understand him as an emphasis on the Dharmakaya. The very interesting ways of approaching Pramana, actually, even within the Indian tradition. It's quite rich. But this is more or less an introductory level of Pramana. So this is common, let's say, it would be acceptable to most Tibetan authors, I think. However, since you mentioned it, let me point out this thing. There is a difference of emphasis in the different Tibetan schools about where does Pramana fit. Is it a Buddhist science or is it one of the worldly sciences? So there is even a debate within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, because in the usual system of 5 vidyas, you know, there's these 5 vidyasthanas, these 5 rigne, I think it's called in Tibetan, which every bodhisattva has to learn in order to become a Buddha. So there is Adhyatma Vidya, which is the actual Buddhist knowledge. Adhyatma is internal. Then there is Hetu Vidya, and then there is Chikitsa, Shilpa Karmasthana, Shabda Vidya. Not in this order, but... So you can see that the special Buddhist knowledge is Adhyatma Vidya. Hetu Vidya is already outside. So one can consider this as a common type of knowledge, which, and the purpose of that is Nigraha, is defeating your opponent. So the main purpose of Hetu Vidya, this knowledge of Hetus, is actually to be able to debate and beat the non-Buddhist. So in one sense, Pramana has a very Buddhist flavor once it is in a Buddhist context, of course. Even the definition of pratyaksha doesn't make sense for a non-Buddhist, strictly speaking. But on the other hand, it's the interface with a broader philosophical world. So within the Tibetan tradition, the emphasis on Pramana really changes from school to school. even in the curriculum, etc., etc. For some, it's extremely important. I think, in my understanding, the school for which it is most important would be the Gelug tradition. The Gelug tradition is really super important, also because of the emphasis on debate. The debate format in the Gelug tradition is based on pramana, basically, and it's based on establishing vyakti, this logical pervasion. A way to make someone lose a debate is to point out that there is no vyakti. So in that tradition, there's a greater emphasis. But if you check, in all the 4 schools or 5, there's some great master who has written about pramana. So you will find of course, in the Sakya tradition, the Sakya Panchen, who apparently wrote his own treatise in Sanskrit, which, however, it's lost. But then he wrote in Tibetan. But then there is also, I think, Gorampa. And in the Gelug tradition, of course, Tsongkhapa and his disciples. In the Kagyu, some of the Karmapas were very strong in pramana, and they have their own tradition. There's an interesting difference in the ordering of the chapters, which actually comes from India, from the Indian commentaries. And then in the Nyingma tradition, well, yes, there is Mipan Rinpoche, but there's actually Longchenpa's commentary on the Pramana Vartika as well. So you can see, in the Dom tradition I don't know, but you can see that at least in this 4 school, every school has some great master who has written about pramana. So it was studied more or less in all the schools. And similarly, if you take any Indian Buddhist philosopher after Dharmakirti, he will refer to pramana. Nobody can skip it. Chandrakirti did not like pramana, but he had to discuss it. And this before Dharmakirti. So, but when Chandrakirti went to Tibet, he was integrated within a pramana system. So, I don't know how much he would have liked it, but it happened. So, okay, this was still part of the introduction, which is okay, because we should try to understand what we are talking about. So, before we actually... Oh, well, I haven't finished telling you how this works.
The editor who added those things in square brackets, the name of him was written in the upper left corner, right?
No.
No, okay.
No. It's from... these I got... Forgot from which of the 2 editions. I think both of them have this.
But, okay, they do the pratyaksha, but this translation proximity to the sentence
Yeah, no, the translation is mine. Okay, so what we have here is these things between square brackets in Sanskrit are from the Sanskrit editor who added these small titles. I have created a numbering system so that you have a kind of topical subdivision. So you can make a topical outline if you want. Then I've added my own translations. The Sanskrit, the one without commas or hyphens, is actually the Sanskrit text. Then you have the translation. Then you have the padacheda, the division of the word. You see, Gurum, Pranamya, Loka, Isham, etc. That's the padacheda. So I split the sandhi for your convenience. Then I've analyzed the words a little bit. I've not been perfectly consistent, but more or less the system I use is that I give you some basic grammatical information. The numbers, in case of nouns, refer to vibhakti, first, second, third, etc. M, N, F refer to the gender. And S, D, P refer to the number, singular, dual, plural. Then I've given some basic information on occasion, when it was not too problematic, like what kind of compound is it? Is it Tatpurusha, Bahubrihi, Karmadharaya, etc.? Of course, this is only indicative because there are cases where compounds can be analyzed in more than one way. And they've not given you the complete analysis in case that a long expression is made of many compounds inside of itself. I haven't done that because it would have taken me too long. And I wanted this to be a kind of example. I'm not sure that I will do this for the whole thing. I wanted this to be an example because part of your own assignment should be to split the sandwich. So those who are auditing should not worry. It's for those who are not auditing. But so you should try to split the sandwich. Maybe you can ask also some of your colleagues help, but it's just that basic thing is quite useful. So I've done this because I'm not sure how confident you are otherwise with the Sanskrit, and I hope this will be an encouragement. And also, by doing this, I hope we can read a little bit faster. But now it's 2 o'clock. So we're having a break.
You want to giving me a hard time. Last time we didn't read anything at all.
No, it seems appropriate.
Thank you very much. I've tried to watch a few of those movies in here, and some of them didn't work.
Really?
Yeah. But thank you very much. They're here with return.
That looks
And
nice.
I think
That's good for them.
yeah.
So, no problem. I think we will record it.
Okay.